There are moments in history that nobody realizes are historic while they're happening. Rooms full of experts, professionals, who spent their entire careers evaluating talent, people paid specifically to make the right call, and they all get it wrong. Catastrophically, memorably, permanently wrong. June 19, 1984 was one of those moments. And the consequences of what happened that afternoon at Madison Square Garden in New York City are still felt every single time someone watches a basketball game, every time someone laces up a pair of sneakers, every time someone dares to believe that the world consistently underestimates the right person at the right moment. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I need you to understand one thing. The man at the center of this story was not a secret. He was not some hidden gem discovered by accident. He was the College Player of the Year. He had just hit the most important shot in NCAA championship history. Every scout, every coach, every general manager in the National Basketball Association had seen him play. Every single one. And still, two teams looked directly at Michael Jordan and chose someone else. That decision haunts the NBA to this day. But here's the part that never gets told correctly. Here's the part that changes everything about how you understand this story. The team that eventually picked Jordan, they weren't happy about it either. Let me take you back, all the way back to before the draft. Back to a gym in Indiana in the spring of 1984, where a college coach named Bob Knight was running Olympic trials and watching a 21-year-old kid from North Carolina do things with a basketball that made veterans stop mid-conversation and stare. Knight was not an easy man to impress. He was famously demanding, notoriously difficult, a coach who had won national championships and had zero patience for players who didn't meet his exacting standards. But what he saw that spring made him do something unusual. It made him pick up the phone and call a friend. That friend was Stu Inman, the general manager of the Portland Trail Blazers, the man who held the second overall pick in the 1984 NBA draft. Knight told Inman point blank, "Take Jordan. Don't think about it. Don't weigh the options. Just take him." Knight said Jordan was the best basketball player he had ever seen, not the best player at the trials, not the best guard, the best player, period. From anyone, at any age, in any setting, the best. Inman listened politely. And then he explained that Portland already had Clyde Drexler, a promising young guard they had drafted the year before. What the Blazers really needed was a center, a dominant big man to anchor the paint. Because in 1984, that's what the NBA ran on. Centers, giants, 7-footers who could control a game from the rim outward. The league had been built on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, Moses Malone, Willis Reed. Even the glamorous Magic Johnson, the man who had reinvented the point guard position, stood 6'9". Size was everything. Size was the game. Knight heard all of this. He understood the logic. And then he said something that became one of the most quoted, most replayed lines in NBA draft history. "Then play him at center." Inman did not listen. And so on June 19, 1984, in the Felt Forum at Madison Square Garden, the Portland Trail Blazers walked to the podium and selected Sam Bowie, a 7'1" center from the University of Kentucky, with the second overall pick of the NBA draft. The crowd received the announcement with polite acknowledgement. The analysts talked about Portland's need for size, about Bowie's wingspan, about his potential. It all sounded reasonable. It all sounded considered. It all sounded, in retrospect, like a catastrophe in slow motion. The moment the announcement was made, the cameras cut to the Chicago Bulls table. And there, among the men in suits consulting papers and pretending to look calm, something interesting was happening. They were grinning. Not because they had planned this. Not because they were genius strategists who had engineered the perfect outcome. They were grinning because of what had just been handed to them by accident. Because the one player they were afraid might get taken before their pick, the player they had been quietly terrified Portland might select, was still available. Number 3. The Chicago Bulls were on the clock. Here is where the story gets complicated. Because if you think the Bulls were celebrating, if you think they were thrilled, if you think they understood what they were about to receive, you are wrong. Rod Thorne was the general manager of the Chicago Bulls in 1984. He was a former player, a basketball lifer, a man who had spent decades in the game. He knew talent. And when David Stern walked to the microphone and the Bulls made their selection, when the name Michael Jordan was announced to the crowd and the New York arena erupted, when the cameras captured the moment, Thorne walked out to face reporters and said something that would follow him for the rest of his career. "We wish he were 7 feet, but he isn't. There just wasn't a center available. What can you do? Jordan isn't going to turn this franchise around. I wouldn't ask him to. He's a very good offensive player, but not an overpowering offensive player." Read that again. Slowly. The man who just drafted Michael Jordan told the assembled press that Michael Jordan was not going to turn the franchise around. The Chicago Tribune ran a headline the next morning that captured the mood perfectly. It read, "Apologetic Bulls stuck with Michael Jordan." The reporter described how the Bulls had tried to trade the pick, how they had sought a center in exchange, how nobody wanted to make that deal, how they were essentially forced to take the greatest player in the history of basketball because nobody else would take him off their hands. Think about what you're hearing. Think about what this means. There is a version of 1984, a version that nearly happened, a version that was one phone call away from being reality, where Michael Jordan is either a Portland trailblazer or the subject of a trade that sends him to some franchise that wanted a center, badly enough to deal for the pick. In that version, the Bulls end up with Sam Bowie or Sam Perkins or a center nobody remembers, and the story of basketball looks completely different. 6 championships, 10 scoring titles, 5 MVPs, all of it gone, rearranged, scattered across a different timeline. But we are not living in that timeline. We are living in the one where everyone got it wrong, and one young man proceeded to spend the next 15 years making the entire basketball world answer for it. Michael Jordan was 21 years old on draft day. He had grown up in Wilmington, North Carolina, the son of James and Dolores Jordan, the 4th of 5 children in a family that understood the value of discipline and work before he ever touched a basketball. His father James worked at a General Electric plant, and his mother was a bank teller. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. What they gave their children was something harder to measure than money, a relentless belief that effort was the only currency that mattered. Jordan was not a prodigy in the obvious sense. He did not emerge from the womb with greatness fully formed. In fact, the most famous early chapter of his story is a rejection. When he tried out for the varsity basketball team at Laney High School as a sophomore, he was cut. The coach, Pop Herring, chose a taller player for the final roster spot and sent Jordan to the junior varsity. The story goes that Jordan went home, locked himself in his room, and cried. And then he came out and started working harder than anyone thought was necessary or even possible. There is a version of that story that gets softened over time. It becomes a motivational anecdote. The future legend gets his first taste of rejection and uses it as fuel. But the reality of it is worth sitting with for a moment. He was 15 years old. He had given everything he had to earn a spot on that team, and a coach who watched him perform looked at what he saw and said, "Not yet. Maybe not ever." The roster spot went to someone else. Jordan went home to a regular bedroom in a regular house in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he sat with that failure, the way any 15-year-old sits with the particular, searing humiliation of being found insufficient at the thing you care about most. What he did next was not dramatic in the way movies portray these moments. There were no speeches, no transformative conversations, no instant revelation. There was just work. He showed up in the gym earlier than everyone else. He stayed later. He practiced moves until they became reflex, practiced shots until the mechanics lived in his hands rather than his head, practiced the footwork and the first step and the mid-range pull-up until they were no longer things he thought about doing, but simply things he did. The work was quiet, and it was sustained, and it was invisible to everyone except the people who had to guard him in practice, and kept finding that the thing he had done to them yesterday now had a counter, and the counter had a counter, and somewhere in the geometry of all those hours in empty gyms, Michael Jordan was becoming something that did not yet have a name. That detail is important, because it is the key to understanding everything that follows. Jordan did not have a passive relationship with failure. He did not absorb disappointment and move on. He converted it. He metabolized it into energy. Every slight, every doubt, every moment when someone looked at him and decided he was not enough, Jordan stored all of it somewhere deep and specific, and he carried it with him onto every court he ever stepped onto for the rest of his career. The cut from the Laney varsity team was the first entry in a catalogue that would grow for years. The third pick in the 1984 NBA draft would become another entry. Every time a defender stopped him, every time a team's defensive scheme temporarily slowed him down, every time a commentator speculated about his limitations, it all went into the same place, feeding the same engine. People who played against Jordan in the later years of his career described something almost disturbing about his competitive focus. It was not simply that he wanted to win. It was that he needed to make the winning mean something specific, needed it to answer a question that had been asked of him years before, needed it to carry the weight of every moment when someone's assessment of him had been wrong. He made the varsity team the following year. Then the year after that, he was one of the most recruited players in the country. He chose the University of North Carolina and enrolled under legendary coach Dean Smith. In his very first year, as a freshman, with the national championship on the line against Georgetown, with the score tied and 17 seconds remaining, Dean Smith drew up a play and gave the ball to Michael Jordan. He hit the shot. The Tar Heels won the championship. He was 18 years old. By the time the 1984 draft arrived, Jordan had been named College Player of the Year, had earned 2 All-American selections, had led his team to a title, and had just returned from representing the United States at the Olympics in Los Angeles, where he led the American team in scoring at 17.1 points per game as they won the gold medal. Bob Knight, the Olympic coach who had called Stu Inman with his urgent plea, later said it was not even close. The gap between Jordan and every other player at those trials was not subtle. It was vast, and still. The third pick. On the night before the draft, Rod Thorne and his assistant Mike Thibault made a private pact with each other. If anyone from the ownership group came into the room trying to pressure them into making a trade, trying to deal away the third pick for a center, they were going to physically lock the door and refuse to let them in until the selection was made. Not because they were sure Jordan was the answer, but because at that point they had resigned themselves to him. Olajuwon was gone. Bowie looked like he was going Portland. Jordan was what the Bulls had. They were going to take him. They were going to manage expectations carefully. And they were going to hope. The moment David Stern announced Jordan's name, even the New York crowd, a crowd with no rooting interest in the Chicago Bulls whatsoever, erupted. Former NBA player and broadcaster Walt Frazier was doing commentary for the broadcast and looked directly into the camera. He acknowledged Jordan's talent, but then added a caveat that captured the conventional wisdom of the era. Michael's got to realize he's not 7 foot, so he's not going to carry a team in the NBA. The announcer for the USA Network broadcast, watching Jordan's highlight reel play on the screen, put it differently. He said the pick made everyone excited. He said Jordan was star material. He said Chicago was going to be in for a real treat. He was slightly more right than Frazier. What is remarkable, watching the tape of that draft broadcast today, is how clearly the crowd understood what had just been handed to Chicago, even while the people in charge of Chicago were apologizing for it. The New York fans did not know Rod Thorne's doubts. They did not know about the failed trade attempts, about the pact to lock the ownership out of the room, about the headline that was already being written in the Tribune offices across the country. They just saw a name called and responded to it, the way people respond to something they instinctively recognize as extraordinary, before the experts have had a chance to tell them otherwise. There is a lesson in that too. The crowd knew before the organization did. The people watching the game understood before the people running it. Sometimes the most important expertise in the world is not the kind that comes with a clipboard and a salary. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to trust what your own eyes are showing you. Now here is the part of this story that becomes almost impossible to fully absorb if you are hearing it for the first time. Because what happened next was not a slow build. It was not a gradual emergence over years of careful development. Michael Jordan arrived in the NBA, and within weeks, people across the league understood that something unprecedented had just walked through the door. In preseason games, before his first official game had even been played, veteran players and coaches were privately pulling each other aside and asking if the others were seeing what they were seeing. Bernard King, who would go on to win the NBA scoring title that year, watched Jordan in an exhibition game, and told Hoop magazine afterward, "All I can say is that the people of Chicago are in for a real treat." Jordan made his official NBA debut on October 26, 1984, at Chicago Stadium. He scored 16 points. The building was barely half full. The Bulls were a franchise that had won 55 games over the previous 2 seasons combined. They were playing in a city that had largely stopped caring about its basketball team. Chicago in 1984 was a sports town in the grip of the Bears, Walter Payton and Jim McMahon, and a defense that would win the Super Bowl the following year. The Bulls were an afterthought. They played in a building that sometimes felt too large for the crowd that bothered to show up. On the night Jordan made his debut, 11,187 people were there. Most of them had no particular expectation of witnessing anything historical. They were watching a basketball game played by a team that had finished 27-55 the year before, managed by men who had publicly apologized for their own draft pick. Within weeks, something shifted. Word travels fast among people who play basketball and people who watch it closely. The conversations happening in locker rooms around the league had a particular quality, a tone that veterans recognize when something genuinely new has appeared. Players who faced Jordan in those early games came away from the experience trying to describe something for which they did not yet have adequate language. He was fast, certainly. He was athletic, unquestionably. But those words had been said about other players. What made Jordan different was harder to name. It was the combination of the physical gifts with a decision-making speed that operated at a different tempo than normal, a capacity to read a defensive scheme and respond to it faster than the defense could register what had happened. By the time a defender had committed to a position, Jordan had already seen the commitment, catalogued it, and was in the process of punishing it. By the end of his first season, Jordan was averaging 28.2 points per game, third in the entire league. He was shooting 51.5% from the field. He was averaging 6 rebounds, 6 assists, and more than 2 steals per game as a rookie. The Bulls went from 27 wins the previous year to 38 wins. They made the playoffs. Jordan won the Rookie of the Year award. He was selected to the All-NBA second team. He was voted a starter to the All-Star game. The franchise that had been apologetic about drafting him had their best season in years. Sam Bowie, meanwhile, played 76 games in his rookie season with Portland. It was the most he would ever play in a single season as a Blazer. The following year, while going up for a rebound in a game, Bowie landed badly and the bone in his left leg snapped. He missed the rest of the season. The year after that, he played 5 games before the other leg broke. The surgery required 3 screws to hold the bone together. An error in the procedure led to a second surgery. He missed 2 years. By the time Bowie had been in the league for 5 seasons, he had played 139 games. He was eventually traded to the New Jersey Nets. His career continued in fragments until 1995, 10 years after he had been drafted second overall, 10 years of what might have been shadowing every step. Here is the thing about Sam Bowie that the easy version of this story never says. He was not a bad basketball player. When healthy, he was skilled, intelligent, a genuine contributor. He averaged nearly 11 points and 7.5 rebounds per game for his career. He blocked shots. He passed with uncommon elegance for a man his size. In a different draft, in a draft without Michael Jordan, he might have been a solid if not spectacular NBA center whose career was cut short by the cruel randomness of injury. In any other draft in any other year, picking Sam Bowie second overall would not have been remembered as a disaster. But there was Jordan, and beside Jordan everything else became a footnote. The Trailblazers understood this slowly, and then all at once. For the first few years there was still a case to be made that it was a reasonable decision given the information available. The NBA was a big man's league. Jordan was undersized. Bowie had seemed healthy. The logic, however misguided, had been real logic. It was the kind of logic that accountants and analysts and front office executives build careers on. The logic of precedent, of historical pattern, of what has worked before. In 1984, the historical record said that championship teams were built around dominant centers. It said that guards, no matter how gifted, required a foundation of interior presence to win at the highest level. The logic was wrong, but it was not foolish. It was simply the reasoning of men who had studied the game as it existed and failed to account for the possibility that the game was about to change, because the person who would change it was sitting one name away on their draft board, waiting for them to call his name. Then Jordan started winning scoring titles. Then he won the Defensive Player of the Year award. Then he was named to the All-Star game for the first time, then the second, then the third. The league began to reorganize itself in response to his presence. Teams designed entire defensive schemes specifically to stop one player. Coaches built careers around figuring out a solution to Michael Jordan, and most of them never found it. The Detroit Pistons built their famous bad boys strategy, physical bruising specifically engineered to punish Jordan at every opportunity, and for several years it worked well enough to prevent championships. But even the bad boys could not stop Jordan permanently. They could delay the inevitable. They could not deny it. And Portland kept rebuilding. They drafted Clyde Drexler, who was excellent. They built a team that was genuinely good, genuinely competitive. In 1992, they made the NBA Finals. They faced the Chicago Bulls. They had a real chance. And in Game 6 of that series, with the Blazers holding a 79-64 lead entering the fourth quarter, it looked for a moment like the universe might offer them a different ending. Jordan scored 18 points in the fourth quarter. The Bulls won 97-93. They won the championship. In the second round of those same playoffs, Jordan had scored 35 points in the first half of one game, and afterward had shrugged at the cameras with an expression that became iconic, a gesture somewhere between bewilderment and apology, as if he himself could not explain what was happening. Stu Inman, the man who had taken the phone call from Bob Knight and chosen not to listen, watched all of it. He never made a public statement about the draft that fully recaptured what it must have felt like to have been in that room on June 19, 1984, to have held the second pick, to have known Jordan was available, and to have called a different name. But the evidence of what he had passed on was written across the entire decade that followed, in statistics and championships, and the slow, inexorable recognition that something genuinely once in a lifetime had walked past his desk, and he had sent it to Chicago. Rod Thorne, for his part, eventually made peace with being the man who drafted Jordan while apologizing for it. Years later, speaking about that day, he acknowledged what everyone already knew. He said the Bulls were lucky the draft came before the Olympics. He said that once the world saw what Jordan did at the 1984 Games, once the gold medal performance was broadcast to an international audience, the conversation would have been entirely different. He said nobody could have predicted what Jordan became, and he was right about that. But the prediction was not what mattered. What mattered was the talent that was visible, that was real and present and obvious to Bob Knight and to every crowd that watched Jordan play college basketball. The talent was there, the eyes just refused to see it clearly enough. Michael Jordan understood all of this. He understood it at the time, and he carried it with him. People who played with him in those early years of his career describe a man who treated every practice like a playoff game, who competed in scrimmages with an intensity that made teammates uncomfortable, who could not turn off the drive to win even in meaningless situations. When asked about the Portland decision in the early years of his career, Jordan was characteristically gracious in public. He said Bowie fit the Blazers' needs better than he would have. He said Portland had made a sensible choice given their roster construction. In private, the people closest to him tell a different story. The draft position was just another piece of data, just another item in the long catalogue of times the world had looked at Michael Jordan and found him wanting. The team that was apologetic about picking him, the GM who said he wouldn't turn the franchise around, the experts who explained that a 6'6" guard could never carry an NBA team. Jordan absorbed all of it, he catalogued it, and every single night he walked onto a basketball court, it was still there, adding fuel to a competitive fire that nobody and nothing could extinguish. There is a moment from the 1988 season that crystallizes this better than anything else. The Chicago Bulls were playing the Cleveland Cavaliers in the first round of the playoffs, a series that would become one of the most famous in NBA history. The series came down to Game 5. The score was tied with 3 seconds left. Cleveland had one of the best defenses in the Eastern Conference. They had Craig Elo, a capable athletic guard, assigned specifically to stop Jordan. With the clock about to expire, Jordan received the ball, elevated, hung in the air for what seemed like a suspended moment outside the normal flow of time, and released a jump shot over Elo's outstretched hand. The ball went in. Jordan leaped. He pumped his fist. He landed and pumped it again. The image, Jordan in full flight, fist raised, the pure physical expression of a man who has answered every question that was ever asked about him, became one of the defining images of American sports in the 20th century. He was the third pick. He was the guy nobody wanted. He was the franchise that apologized for having to take him, and in that moment, and in the 6 championships that followed, and in the 10 scoring titles, and in the complete transformation of the NBA from an American league into a global phenomenon that his name and his image and his Air Jordan sneakers carried to every corner of the world. In all of that, the answer to every skeptic and doubter and apologetic general manager was written clearly enough for anyone to read. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about a draft. It is not about one bad decision by the Portland Trail Blazers or one reluctant selection by the Chicago Bulls. It is about something much older and much more universal than basketball. It is about the gap between how the world evaluates people and what people are actually capable of. It is about the systems we build to identify greatness and how consistently those systems fail when something genuinely new appears. In 1984, the NBA had a template for what a franchise player looked like. He was tall. He played in the paint. He controlled the game through physical dominance rather than skill and speed, and an incomprehensible will to win. Michael Jordan did not fit the template, so the template said, third pick. The template was wrong. And here is where this story becomes yours. Because if you have ever been evaluated by a system that was not built to see you, if you have ever been the third pick in someone else's ranking of what matters, then you already know what it feels like to stand in Michael Jordan's shoes on that June afternoon in 1984. You know what it is to be seen and still overlooked. You know what it is to be present and still absent from someone's vision of what success looks like. The difference is what you do with it. Jordan did not spend his career demanding credit for what had been denied him. He did not stop the game to point at the scoreboard and remind everyone of what the draft board had said. He simply played. He played with a focus and an intensity and a commitment to excellence that turned doubt into irrelevance and skepticism into ash. He played in a way that made the original question, should he have been picked first, should he have been picked second, not just answerable, but obvious, painfully, historically obvious. That is the choice that sits in front of anyone who has ever been underestimated. You can spend your energy proving the doubters wrong, which is useful. You can spend your energy making sure everyone knows you are underestimated, which is less useful. Or you can do what Jordan did. You can absorb the information, internalize the fuel, and redirect every ounce of it into becoming so undeniable that the question answers itself. The Portland Trail Blazers never won an NBA championship. In 4 decades since the 1984 draft, in the long shadow of the decision Stu Inman made on that afternoon in New York, they have not lifted a single trophy. The Chicago Bulls, the franchise that was stuck with Michael Jordan against their will, won 6. Bob Knight, the coach who made the phone call that nobody listened to, who saw Jordan at 21 years old and called him the best basketball player he had ever seen, lived long enough to be thoroughly, completely, and historically vindicated. Sam Bowie, for his part, became something more complex than a villain in someone else's story. He became a man who carried an impossible burden, not the burden of failure, which is hard enough, but the burden of comparison to someone incomparable. His name is remembered not for his own career, but as the answer to a trivia question. He understood this. In interviews over the years, he spoke about it with a dignity that deserved more acknowledgement than it typically received. He did not choose his injuries. He did not choose to exist in the same draft class as Michael Jordan. He simply showed up, as all of us do, and let the circumstances arrange themselves around him. What happened after was not entirely within his control. Jordan's control over what happened after was a different matter entirely. When Jordan finally retired, for the last time, truly the last time, walking away from the Washington Wizards in 2003 at the age of 40, the numbers he left behind were not just records. They were arguments. They were the permanent statistical refutation of every expert who had called a different name first. 30 points per game for his career, the highest average in NBA history, 6 championships, 6 finals MVPs, 5 MVP awards, 14 All-Star Game appearances. The Defensive Player of the Year in the same season, he won the scoring title, which nobody in the history of the sport had done before or has done since. A global cultural footprint that transformed basketball from a sport with an American audience into a universal language that children in Lagos and Manila and Warsaw and Sao Paulo grew up speaking. All of that from the third pick. All of that from the franchise that apologized. The 1984 NBA draft is studied in business schools. It is taught in courses about decision-making, about cognitive bias, about the ways human beings systematically undervalue assets that do not conform to existing categories. The lesson people draw from it is usually about the Blazers and their catastrophic miss. But the more interesting lesson, the one that lingers, is about what Jordan did with the information he was given. He was told, clearly and unambiguously, by the people whose job it was to know. You are not the top choice. You are not what we wanted. You are not going to turn this around. He heard all of that. He remembered all of it. And then he spent 15 years making every single person who said those words watch him turn everything around, over and over, until the very idea of the world without Michael Jordan at the center of it seemed like an alternative history too impoverished to contemplate. There is a 14-year-old somewhere watching this right now who has been told they are not the top choice. Not for the team, not for the school, not for the job, not for the opportunity. Somebody with a clipboard and a system and a very confident sense of how talent is distributed has looked at this person and ranked them 3rd or 5th, or not at all. And that person is carrying that information the way Jordan carried it, quietly, precisely, with a clarity about exactly what it means and exactly what it demands. What it demands is work. What it demands is the refusal to let someone else's failure of imagination define the limits of your own. What it demands is the specific, difficult, daily choice to convert the weight of being underestimated into something that propels you forward rather than holds you back. The draft was June 19, 1984. The first championship was June 12, 1991. 7 years. 7 years of being the player the Bulls were apologetic about, the guard who wasn't 7 feet, the man who wasn't going to turn the franchise around. 7 years of practice and development, and the slow, unglamorous accumulation of the skills and habits and mental toughness that separate the third pick from the greatest of all time. None of it happened fast. All of it happened because someone decided that what the world said about him was data, not destiny. The decision made in 1984 still haunts the NBA. It haunts every front office that builds its evaluation system around templates and conventional wisdom and the safe consensus choice. It haunts every scout who ever watched a player who didn't fit the expected profile and wrote the wrong thing in their notebook. It haunts the game itself, which has spent 40 years trying to answer the question of whether it will ever see another player like the one it almost failed to recognize. It probably won't. That is what makes Jordan's story the one it is. But the structure of the story, the underestimation, the doubt, the third pick who becomes the first name, that structure is not unique to him. It has happened before. It will happen again. It is happening right now to people you know, perhaps to you. The question is what they do with it. The question is what you do with it. If you have been the third pick in someone's draft board, if you know exactly what it feels like to be seen and still overlooked, to be present and still passed over, then this story is not just about basketball. It is about you. It is about the gap between how the world ranks people and what people are actually worth. And it is about the one thing that gap cannot account for. What happens when the person who was underestimated decides once and for all that the evaluation was wrong? Michael Jordan decided. The rest is history. Every championship, every scoring title, every moment of impossible grace on a basketball court, every sneaker sold, every child who grew up watching the number 23 and believing that something extraordinary was possible, all of it flows from a June afternoon in 1984 when the world got it wrong, and one young man from North Carolina quietly decided he was going to spend the rest of his life proving it. He did. If this story reached something in you, if you know someone who has been the third pick, who has been told they are not enough, who is carrying that knowledge and trying to figure out what to do with it, share this with them, not as consolation, as evidence, because the evidence is overwhelming and it all points in the same direction. The world's evaluation of your potential is not the final word. The only final word is the one you write yourself, on the court, in the work, in the years that follow, when you get the chance to answer every question that was ever asked about you. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories like this one. Stories about the moments before greatness that nobody photographed. Stories about the rooms where the wrong decision was made and the right one took root anyway. Stories about the gap between what the world sees and what is actually there, and the people who close that gap by refusing to let someone else define the distance. The draft is not the story. What comes after the draft is the story. And Michael Jordan's story does not end at the third pick. It begins there. It begins in a room where nobody wanted him badly enough, and it ends, if it ends at all, somewhere out beyond the reach of statistics and records and trophies, in the part of human memory where the truly great ones live forever.